So H-1B is a type of visa that is sponsored by an employer for a individual qualified to perform what is called a specialty occupation.
Okay.
And the government defines a specialty occupation, a role or a position that requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree for entry into the profession. Most people would think, oh, it's at least a bachelor's degree, but apparently not, right? You can become a registered nurse with an associate's degree. And because of that, depending on the role and the description of the duties, the government may not agree that this position qualifies as a specialty occupation. So in other words, you may or may not be able to sponsor a nurse for an H-1B. What this does is the new visa, so the people who've never had this before, have to enter a lottery because there's more people who want them than visas available.
Welcome to Business Ninjas, brought to you by Write For Me, where you'll hear from business leaders who are out there growing their business and slaying it every day. Learn from the masters. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Business Ninjas. I'm here today with Elizabeth G., CEO and Managing Attorney at the G Law Firm. Elizabeth, how are you today?
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
My distinct pleasure. Appreciate you spending some time with us on Business Ninjas. Please tell us a bit about yourself and about the G Law Firm.
Sure. Where do I start? My name is Elizabeth G. I'm a corporate and business immigration attorney. And what that means is under the big umbrella of immigration law, we support businesses, individuals, and families in procuring work visas and employer-sponsored permanent residency. Doesn't mean that we don't help other cases in terms of family-based or even naturalizations, but working with work visas such as an H-1B, O visa, NIW, those types of matters.
Not to open a giant can of worms, but I assume there's a lot of challenges in your world at the moment.
Yes, I mean, it's like whiplash, 24/7 because, you think you know something after doing this a while and then, things kind of change. It does, in all honesty, feels like, the rug being pulled from under you. But I think, it's a true testament to, resilience. Resilience on the part of our clients and the people we serve, and the resilience on part of folks like myself who are in this industry. And at the end of the day, I think as long as no one gives up, we're going to get to the other side.
Excellent, excellent. Well, hey, let's talk about you a little bit. What's your background? How did you end up in this field of law?
Sure. So my family immigrated to the United States when I was 6. And, I grew up in Chicago and, went from the city life to the suburban life and was very fortunate to have grown up in the North Shore of Chicago. And that's where I received my education through high school, and then decided that I didn't want to be a small fish in the fishbowl or the big fish in the fishbowl. And I had to venture out because I felt like the world was bigger than what I was used to. So I went to Ohio and I ended up at the Ohio State University. I'm a proud Buckeye. And there, initially my dream was my dream kind of morphed from like the second grade. As soon as I became, proficient in the English language, it's like a light bulb, right, turned on. And I was like, oh, I want to be a lawyer. And, I like funny story that I tell, at networking events of all places is that, as a second grader, I laid my eyes on this episode of Divorce Court, not realizing that that it was like a dramatization, but I thought it was real life. And there happened to be a female attorney who was advocating so zealously for her client. And something happened, people were crying, she saved the day, and I'm like, I want to be her. And from that moment on, I, like searched far and wide. I'm like, what is a lawyer? What do lawyers do? How do you become one? And I think from that moment on, and once my parents realized that I had some sort of, academic aptitude, they're like, well, she's going to be a lawyer and that's what we're going to support. So it's been an endeavor, a lifelong endeavor. Unfortunately, in college, I got distracted. So there were so many other things, right? So I left my comfortable, suburban life to go venture out and do something different away from, all the community that I grew accustomed to and basically starting over and having to reinvent myself. I just became very interested in other things. I'm like, oh, I want to be uh, a diplomat. I'm like, oh wait, but then you can't be a diplomat and be a mom because you have to move around every so many years. Okay, scrap that. Okay, maybe I want to be a professor. So this journey, like that, I kind of went full force from the second grade onwards, kind of halted when I was on the verge of getting my degree, and I was like, I don't know what I want to do. So, and I did burn out a little bit, because I just went really hard and I'm like, double major, got to get out, I got to graduate before the fourth year because, overachiever tendencies. And once I got out, I truly didn't have anything left in the gas tank. And took about a 3-year hiatus and I went to go live in my native country, which was South Korea. And, people think, well, you're Korean. How difficult can that be? But perspective wise, I didn't know this country. I didn't grow up there. I was just born there, brought here, and didn't know anything about functioning as a grown, adult. I was just as much a foreigner as anyone else. And it was kind of made more difficult because people didn't understand. While I looked like them and I spoke the language, why I was still a foreigner. So that's a whole nother episode. But after like 3 years of some soul searching, returned to the United States and decided, well, am I ready now? Am I ready to go back to school? And I was not. But I ended up kind of working at a boutique practice that practiced solely immigration. So that's where I got my first interest in it. And then I realized that I can make a difference in people's lives, not just by being in a courtroom, but also by knowing this area of law and helping people strategize the best way to get there. So a couple of years in as a paralegal. Got distracted again and had a side hustle before side hustles were popular. But it was in tutoring and education, and I was mentoring other kids like me, except they came older, so they were like already in middle school or high school and expected to compete at the same level as everyone who's been here their whole lives to gain entry to university and beyond. And I started, tutoring them in the SAT, college admissions process. But like with, with anything, after they graduated, I kind of was like, okay, what do I do now? I felt like an empty nester when I was in my 20s. So that's when I was like, okay, I better go to law school. So that's when I kind of got everything out of my system and decided to go to school. So by then I was considered a non-traditional student. I really enjoyed my time, during law school, working full time and then going to school at night. But, I think I was only able to do that not only with the love and support of my mom, my family, who did all the other stuff to, take those off my plate, but more importantly, because I had a very firm resolve as to what I wanted to do with that degree. So, there was never a question that I wanted to practice immigration. Becoming an entrepreneur, it was something totally different, but something that probably was in the making because I got a taste of it with my education business. But I think sometimes things happen in life where you're pushed in a direction where it's inevitable that you're going to be there. And it's not based on your own timing, but sometimes the universe's timing. And, they needed me, right? So I started my firm in 2018, and haven't looked back.
Was that gap in education, did it make it harder for you when you got back to school, or was it easier because you really had your feet under you, you understood process and your own, studying abilities and what worked for you?
Great question. So, when we started law school during orientation, the speakers and administrators were like, "Hey, law school is something that you don't do just because your parents want you to do it, or somebody told you to do it, or you loved watching episodes of Suits and you wanted to be that person, right? So you really have to have a good reason, otherwise you're not gonna last." Sure enough, I think for me. That was what made the difference, right? Like academically, I think, after a certain point, they have those standardized tests to kind of weed out folks who are not going to survive the rigor of the curriculum. But it came down to the drive. Like, how badly do you want this? Right? Because after law school, like, we had the bar exam, and I can tell you another story about that. But, you kind of have to come to a point where you're like, yeah, it seemed cool because, I think lawyers on TV are kind of cool or whatever. Or secondly, I hate it when I like cringed on the inside when I heard people say, oh, I'm in law school because people told me I'm good at arguing. Really? That's all you think is needed to survive?
They may not have been
Law
complimenting you at the time. You just sort of
Uh,
wanted to hear it. Yeah.
you heard what you wanted to hear, exactly. But beyond that, yes, natural talents aside, you really had to have that grit. Otherwise, we couldn't have survived the 3.5 years and that it took to, like every day, like go to work from 8 to 5 and then get out like as close to 5 as possible to make that drive down, Atlanta traffic to get to school, right? And then you're there for another 3 hours. You go home, you got to do some homework and get some reading done before you go to bed. And then on top of that, I realized after my first year, I had gained a bit of weight. In college, you deal with freshman 15, but in law school, it starts at like, first year 30. And I was like, this does not feel good. So I started working out, and the only time I could squeeze that in was at 6 a.m. So my days started at 4, not because I wanted to, but because I had to do that in order to do all the things I wanted to do. If you ask me today if I can get up at 4 a.m. to go work out, I probably could not unless I was paying someone a lot of money to do something very fast and very advantageous or something like that. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the G Law Firm. Are your clients predominantly individuals looking for help with citizenship and visas, or do you also work with companies who are looking for talent and trying to help them get here?
Sure. For now, I think it's more like 50-50. So, companies first. So there, I love working with companies that come to me and they're like, we've never done this before, but we've identified a diamond in the rough. We love this person. We want to do everything we can so that this person can stay with us and do their thing for our company for as long as possible. So what does it take? What can we do? How do we get started? And I love, the education piece where I want to give them as much information so they're making an informed decision. But on the other hand, it opens up another like strategic advantage for these companies that have never tapped into the global workforce, right? So before, people would be like, sponsorship of visa sounds complicated. Oh, I don't know. Does it cost a lot of money? Is it worth it? But once they realize like the advantage of having the right person in the right seat, they're like, where do we get more of this person? Where do we get more of this work ethic that we haven't seen in the past decade in the United States, right? Where do we see, where do we get this, example that we could, plug into every department, right? And once companies kind of realize that and learn how to leverage that, they're like, hey, I want to do another one. So they come back and they're like, hey, we found someone else and there's a similar situation. Can we do the thing again? Right. So they may not know all the language or the vocabulary, but that's okay because I love, being the person to kind of give them the happy news. Yes, there's a solution and there's a way we can do what you want. On the other hand, we have individuals who are more like, hey, I am I graduated from school. I'm in my OPT period and I found this employer who's willing to sponsor me. Will you please talk to them and see so that they could grasp a better understanding of what it all entails and, what they need to do because they're open to doing it. That is such a difficult conversation to have for an individual, especially if they're in a position asking for a job, right? But you have to really trust yourself and trust in your abilities and the value that you bring to an organization to be able to put that on the table and have somebody say yes. Because that first yes is so gratifying and it's so exciting. And I could, like feel that, when as I'm explaining the the process, the cost, right, the timeline, and everyone's just basically very excited to get this done and very motivated to get this done. So sometimes the individuals come to me first and then they introduce me to the company, or we have individuals who are eligible for what is called a self-petition, where they don't need anyone to petition them. They can do it on their own by, because of the specialness, we'll say, of their merit. And, again, I love working with families. I love working with individuals and also companies, because at the end of the day, it's all people, right? So, and that's how I see it, right? And the rules are just a little different.
What does that timeline look like these days, from the moment either a corporation or an individual reaches out to you till you get them to the finish line? What does that look like now?
Well, it depends on the type of case, right? So one of the things that we're like in the thick of right now is H-1 season. So H-1B is a type of visa that is sponsored by an employer for a individual qualified to perform what is called a specialty occupation.
Okay.
And the government defines a specialty occupation, a role or a position that requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree for entry into the profession. So it's not enough that the employer says, oh, we can make the requirements whatever you want because we want this person. But the Department of Labor and U.S. Immigration has to agree that minimum for entry into this profession is a bachelor's degree. So let me ask you, do you know what is a minimum educational requirement for entry as a nurse?
I do not.
Right. And most people would think, oh, it's at least a bachelor's degree, but apparently not, right? You can become a registered nurse with an associate's degree. And because of that, depending on the role and the description of the duties, the government may not agree that this position qualifies as a specialty occupation. So in other words, you may or may not be able to sponsor a nurse for an H-1B. So what this does is this visa is the new visa. So the people who've never had this before have to enter a lottery because there's more people who want them than visas available. And that lottery period opens in March. And I call that my Christmas and, March experience, because you like enter all these people's names and their data and all that stuff. And then at the end of March, they, do a lottery and you get notifications from the government saying, boop, change to your profile, boop. And every time you log in, you see the new names of people who were selected. And I get to be the person who gives them the good news. Right. And then the flip side of it is I'm also the person who tells the people who weren't selected, hey, we've got to come up with a way for you to maintain the status quo so that we can apply again next year. And maybe because it's purely luck. Right. Yeah.
That was my next question, is if someone is denied, is there a cycle to the process and they are allowed, or once they're denied, that's sort of the end of the conversation?
So the lottery process is just a lottery. So you have to be selected to be given permission to even apply for this visa, right? So if you're not selected, you don't get to apply, right? So then the next part of it is we apply and then we wait for the decision, right? So to get approved, and then after you're approved, right, you transition your status into the new, right? So it's kind of I would say, being organized is probably one of the best advantages to making sure that, things happen in a timely way, but also to kind of be able to help as many people as you can, right? I can't just sit there with one case and, put all my, effort into one case. And I wish it were like that, but it's not, right? So in terms of looking at this from a business perspective, as long as we stay on top of deadlines, we stay on top of processes, we stay on top of, our internal quality assurance and processes, we could probably multiply the good effect that we're having on so many of our clients across more clients, so that we can deliver better, good news to as many people as possible.
Can't be fun to make the other calls,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's usually, hey, so I'm the type of person where, hey, instead of focusing on something we cannot control, let's talk about what we can. What other options do we have, right? So, I was reading a book called Winning by Tim Grover. So I'm the type of person where, hey, instead of focusing on something we cannot control, let's talk about what we can. What other options do we have? Right. So, I was reading a book called Winning by Tim Grover. And he said the best like players or the best people that he's coached into becoming great personal trainers is not when people had a lot of options. They had a plan A, plan B, plan C. It was when this was it. This was plan A and that was it. Right. But, you know, immigration, I think, is a little bit different, where, yes, the more options you have, sometimes you can get kind of sidetracked and distracted because of the many options, but you have to be hyper focused on what you truly want and you go for that hard, whether it be budgeting, because you want to work with a specific, expert or specialist in that type of visa, or whether it be, doing the work that you need to find the employer that's going to sponsor you, going through the grueling process of interviews and Zoom meetings and all that stuff to get that dream job, whatever it is. You have to be hyper focused on what it is you want. Then if that doesn't pan out, it's always great to have an alternative, right? With immigration being so unforgiving, right? With one denial actually causing you to have to leave the country, or worse, being forcibly removed from the country, the stakes can't be higher than, I don't think, than anything else. So I don't think there's any fault in having alternatives, but it's always a blessing when someone has more than one option. But I do always ask, which one do you want? Like, which one, if you had no other option, which one would you go with? Yeah. And we start there.
What differentiates you? I assume there's competition in your space. What makes the G law firm stand out?
Well, I mean, competition, yes, because there's, other, superb business immigration attorneys. But I think, I don't think every client is for me, right? And I don't think, I don't think in terms of in terms of that, right? So I feel like in order for us to have a great working relationship, right, there has to be that, that click, right, between myself personally and also my firm's values and our mission, our culture, has to be what you're looking for, right? If you're like, hey, I don't, I just want to pay the least amount of possible and get the least amount done, there's, consumers like that. And then there's others who are like, I don't care how much it costs, but they do really care. But, but I want to work with the best, right? And then, they have to define, how they define the best, right? But for me, I think it's more, I've been told that my clients appreciate my candor, my straightforwardness. And at the same time, I'm like, if I'm going to give you a solution, I'm going to give you at least two, right? If when at all possible. And I'm going to tell you, if we only have one, we only have one. So we got to go for this really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything because of how it's going to make you feel. And people appreciate that because it helps them kind of clear the noise and get hyper focused on what matters and what, is going to give them. So I would say it's like the more personal touch, despite the volume or the size that we, or the sheer number of clients that we want to help. Communication for me is very important. And, sometimes it's not perfect, right? We're not always perfect, but we always try to get back to people so that people should not feel ghosted by their law firm. Not only is that an ethical problem, but I think that's another, laundry list of problems. But, a client of mine told me a few months back, he goes, it's one thing when, we come to you attorneys or doctors or, professionals seeking their expertise. But, when the professional service provider, and he was specifically talking about his previous attorney, when the lawyer that you put your trust in, not only by signing a contract and paying money, but giving you all your documents and telling you everything that occurred, when they ghost us, or if they don't return our calls or don't communicate with us, that is trauma, right? So as a part of my case type that we handle, we do something called U visas, and these are specifically reserved for victims of specific crimes. So already, right, you're dealing with folks who've already experienced severe enough crime to qualify for this immigration benefit, but they're also dealing with underlying effects of being a victim of, say, an armed robbery, right? And they could have sleep issues, anxiety, PTSD, all of the above. And then, you put all that trust, you're extremely vulnerable into a law firm and they ghost you or they feel ghosted, right? He's like, that's trauma. And that like hit so hard because I'm like, wow, right? That's awful. Sounds awful. So now, of course, and every side to us, every story has two sides, right? So it's relative, right? So if you have somebody who's incessantly calling you and demanding your attention every, few minutes, and if you don't call like right back and they think you're, ghosting them, that's one thing. That's probably, I would say, a side effect of whatever that they're dealing with because of the crime. But if you go on for weeks and then the attorney gives you their cell phone number to make you feel special, yet you don't pick up the call ever, then, yeah, relatively speaking, that might be a problem, right? So I think I'm not saying I'm perfect, but at the end of the day, even though it's so hard sometimes to be the person to say, hey, I don't have any updates for you, but I called you back because I wanted you to hear from me. Or by extension of me, my staff, um, we always want to be able to do that, right? Because I can't be at 10 places at once, but I can make sure that, we are letting you know that you're being heard, right? Even though we might not have the answer that you're looking for.
Well, hey, if retaining an attorney in any context requires a lot of trust and openness, and in yours, there's a lot at stake. I mean, this is an emotional conversation, whether you're going to be able to cross an ocean and have a new life depending on the outcome of this relationship. So yeah, I could see how people take that pretty seriously on the other side. Switch gears for a second. I'm assuming that your business came kind of to a screeching halt during COVID because no one could travel and courts weren't in session and things like that. Tell me about the challenges and opportunities of growing your firm through COVID.
So interestingly enough, it didn't. I mean, I'll have to go back and look at the numbers, but we weren't I mean, like I don't do the court stuff, right? In solidarity of my colleagues who do, I support when I can, I make donations when I can, and I take people out to lunch and we talk on the phone so that they could vent. I do all that stuff, but I was never blessed with the gift of working on court cases, mainly because I didn't have the language skills. Right? I do speak another language, but it's not the right one. So, the court stuff was not anything that I've done before. So that stuff was pretty rough, I've heard, right? Where, court, was not in session and people who were on like long-term payment plans were just disappearing, not paying, things like that. But for me, it stayed pretty stable, especially because during that time, a lot of people like, and I did a lot of H1s, right? So we go back to this because it's actually my favorite type of visa, but don't tell anyone. But
Did.
the H1s proceed, they're very employer specific, position specific, and location specific. So, for example, prior to COVID, say that the H1 employee had to work at the office, which was located at another, right, at city like Atlanta, right? But then during COVID, they realized, with the work from home orders, they could work from anywhere. And their girlfriend or boyfriend was living, in another state. So they moved, but they're still performing their work. Well, in theory, you need to have filed an amendment and to amend the work location for that H-1B. So when HR departments and employers started realizing what was happening, we were pretty busy with that because it's time sensitive. In order to maintain compliance is key to maintaining an H-1B workforce. So that kept us pretty busy. Even though people were not like allowed to come in and out of the country because of travel restrictions and things like that, it doesn't mean that they weren't allowed to apply for them, right? So as we discussed, we started with things changing all the time. Even at during COVID, things were changing a lot, right? So we always had to be on the ready and prepared to, like have a preparedness or response protocol so that people weren't losing valuable time and opportunity, because to some of these people, time was literally money,
Of course.
right?
All right. Look down the road a year from now. What are some things you'd like to be celebrating personally and professionally?
So a year from now. So personally, I'd like to, and it's hopefully going to happen in the next couple of months. So, we have a daughter. I have one, my one and only, and she's 7, turning 35. No, she's turning 8 almost. And we haven't done the whole Disney thing yet because we wanted her to be at an age where she could truly appreciate the magic and experience and have it a lasting core memory for her. So we've been telling her, oh, you have to be, a certain height. And they're gonna get an invitation for princesses, and she's still very much into princesses. So we're hoping to take her for her birthday, like, the whole surprise, pull her out of school, and then, we're flying to, the princess, do that thing this year. So fingers crossed we execute that surprise, flawlessly. Professionally, I'd like to, grow my business, at least by, 30 to 40% this year, so that we can help, and that, because that would be a sign that we've helped more people. And also, so that, I can focus on doing more, that is more than, sitting and, reviewing papers and reviewing cases. Because ultimately, I feel like I love practicing law. I love the business of law, and I want to be able to teach this to future lawyers, especially in the immigration space. So, eventually, I'd love to be an adjunct somewhere, to be able to teach and put out, really powerful, like, immigration attorneys who are not only well versed in the practice of it, in the law, but also in the business of it, so that we don't burn out, right? Because, right now I see a lot of folks burning out, some people leaving the profession altogether or leaving the area, like, leaving. But, what I have tons of like criminal law attorney friends, divorce law, attorney friends, and everyone's burned out at some point, right? If you go that hard all the time, right? But I want folks to be kind of like equipped, right? With the tools, right? With the resources that I didn't have, that I had to kind of stumble upon and then eventually learn to uh, go get, right? Figuring out what I need and then going get. I'd like to kind of like, I wonder what it'll be like to have a future generation of attorneys, immigration attorneys specifically, who come out of school practice ready and who are, like armed with not only being able to practice this nuanced area of law, but also, be successful business people.
You're actually describing a situation that covers almost all educational pathways in this country. I meet people from every pathway, doctor, lawyer, musician, architect, whatever it is, and they teach you in a very narrow lane the skill set, but not the practical application, how to run a business, how to read a contract, how to go out there and thrive as a human being in that career path. So I applaud you wanting to go back and extend the education to all the real world application of what you do, because it's a gap in most universities that I'm aware of.
I think it's probably because of like the business model, like you get out of law school, depending on the ranking of your school, you get ferried to these, firms that are expected to teach you how to practice law, right? They're expected to, and you're going to cut your teeth there, give them your time, put in the long hours and put in the work, earn your stripes, and then move on. But I think that model is kind of not caught up with the times, right? So, we come from a place where, yeah, some people may have been entrepreneurial prior to going to law school. Some people may only be interested in the business of law because, most jurisdictions, lawyers can only be in, like, the law business can only be held by someone who's a lawyer, right? So, and others might be only interested in the practice of law, right? So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying one is better than the other or one person should be a one woman show. I'm saying you need to have a very clear understanding as to what you want, not what society is telling you, not what your school's ranking is telling you, not what big law, medium size, whatever is telling you. Not be pushed into a certain direction because you have no options, right? So it's kind of like, let's see what else is out there, right? Like I went to a law school that wasn't like everyone's first choice because of its ranking, we'll just say, right? For me, I knew going in, I didn't care where it was. It needed to allow me to work while I went to school because I had a mortgage. I had real life bills that I could not just float on student loans. And then secondly, it just gives me that piece of paper on the wall that says I can practice law. Everything else I'll do on my own. That was my mentality. And so, a rude awakening. So, after I completed my first year, I was doing a lot of networking because of the type of work I was doing. And, met this great partner at a big name, fancy law firm. And he was just like, oh my God, you're so great. You're so smart. We'd love to offer you, something, but can you transfer to at least this other school? And I said, why? And he said, our law firm does not hire from people from your school.
Oh my.
And I said, oh, is that so? No, but I really appreciate that because that type of candor, it wasn't like sugar coated. He didn't give me the runaround. It was more like a very realistic um fact at that time. And I was like, and I thought about it. I'm like, can I get back to you? So I did the numbers with the transfer credits, how much more money I would have to spend, how much more schooling I would have to do. And I was like, it wasn't worth it for me. I just wanted to go full speed, just go and get it done. And this would have probably tacked on another, 6 months to a year of additional schooling with no guarantees because I didn't know he was going to stay partner, right? So, and I was like, for my life and for what I wanted in that moment, it didn't make sense. I said, thank you so much, but no, I'm just going to continue and I'm going to finish, right? And I think that's what kind of put fire under my behind to graduate a 4-year program in like 3.5, because I'm like, I need to get the heck out. I need to do what I intended to do and not be distracted by the bells and whistles and the glamour and all that stuff. Because realistically speaking, I saw Suits too. I wanted to be that girl running around in her stilettos in New York City, but there's no flipping way that I was going to be able to do that, let alone, right? At that age, like grind that hard. I was like, no. And look, I mean, I think I'm better for it, right? To everyone, I think it's different. You can't cookie cutter one's, career aspirations or, experience. And that's what I want to show. That just because you didn't go to big law or just because you weren't that associate offered that fancy 6-figure salary doesn't mean that going to law school was a bad idea or that you failed, right? I mean, I make more money working for myself than I would have working at one of those fancy law firms, right? There was a time in my career where did have an opportunity to work at something similar, but more for immigration. And ultimately, what kind of solidified my resolve and my commitment to my business was when we were undergoing the salary negotiations. And then I did the math. I'm not a math person. My husband had to help me, but we, looked at the numbers and we're like, this is what I'm leaving on the table. This is what they're offering me, but it's always going to be determined by someone else.
Yep.
And I was like, that did it for me, where I'm like, no, no, thank you.
Well,
But
I hope your clients recognize that they've got someone who works tirelessly and is that passionate about helping them find their path to what they want and to success in this country. That's fabulous. Please tell us, what's your URL? Where can people find the G Law Firm and what social media outlets to use as well?
so our website is at www.myglaw.com. So that's spelled MYJILAW.com. Social media, I think we're on LinkedIn and we're also on Instagram, but I don't know about anything else. So most of our business comes from word of mouth, where we have, happy clients refer their friends and family. And we also have, I have a great network of colleagues where we have a no judgment zone where we're like, hey, I don't know anything about removal defense, but I got a call from someone who did X, Y, and Z. Can you help this person? And they're like, sure. Conversely, they're like, hey, I have somebody who has an H-1B, but this happened and that happened. That's your thing, right? Yes, it is. So we, always collaborate in that regard. And I love it when, we hear from people that have already seen my work. So
Hey, theoretically, being a human is a team sport, so it's nice to hear that other lawyers are playing nice in the sandbox with you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Elizabeth G., thank you for spending some time with us on Business Ninjas. All the best to you and yours. I hope your daughter doesn't watch marketing related podcasts, so the surprise doesn't ruined. And continued success at the G Law Firm.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I loved being here on the podcast.
Thank you for being with us. Be well.